So let's, questions from the study group first. Hans?
Request for APS staff. It's not exactly a question. I'm tired of hearing the school estimates aren't any good, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Can we just, and I'll happily go into my archives in my office and dig out all the papers that Meg and Todd and others of us have been looking at for the past decade, but we have the numbers to come up with how we're doing on the 3-year, 5-year, 6-year, 10-year projections. And I know they're not going to be perfect, and I feel like we hold on to this 1-year projection when what this study group is trying to do is to look out 10 years, look out 15 years, and we need to, it's irrelevant whether we're right on the 1 year as far as this committee is concerned, and I would just love to really know how we've been doing on that projection, and because I feel like we keep having all this rumor and innuendo conversation about, oh, our projections are no good, and I really have no sense of whether they're good or not. And is that possible to do that, or can I get logged somewhere? Or?
Rich began to answer that question for you, I think, with the plus or minus 2% response.
Well, no, but did you look at our 6 to 10 year projections historically? No. No. Right.
This was a methodological review.
Right.
It wasn't
Right.
a review on results. So no.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking the district.
Right. I'd like to ask the district to give us a report of how.
All right, we'll come back to the committee with that. Other questions from the study group? Gabriella?
You need your own mic.
Yes, thank you. I'm Gabriela Uda with the committee. Maybe this question is now moot because of what you just said right now in terms of it was a methodology question, but it was also a review of sort of the results. So one of the questions I had was, how do the methodologies that you use, and also then when you looked at, take into consideration or factor some of the mobility that that is very reflective of this community? So for example, military, we have the Pentagon. We have also the Defense University around here. So there's a lot of folks that come in and out, also State Department folks. So what type of factors or what do you have in place to account for that? And then the other piece also is certain phenomena. One thing I worry about is when you rely on retrospective data. So looking back, how do you account for blips? So when we had the recession, when we looked at the numbers, we had a vast number of kids that came into the system because parents could not afford their private schools, and they stayed in the system. So when you just look at data, if you miss that point, right, or if you don't look far enough to capture that data, how do we know what is happening in the future? I know nobody has a crystal ball, but how do we know that, or what are the other databases or sources out there that we could possibly look to help be more accurate with the 5 and 10 year projection?
I'm going to be honest with you. I think, first of all, you are accurate here. I want to be clear about that. In my personal esteemed opinion, I'm going to go back to the first question in terms of military. How do you account for that? That's a great question. Migration, all different kinds of people moving in and moving out. Here's the thing. The progression ratios are supposed to be this catch-all basin for all this type of migration going in and out. There's a net. Either it's plus or minus. The question is it specifically looking at military migration or migration due to people moving in for new housing? The answer is no, you can't break it down that way. But it aggregates and it does look at the net effect. So for instance, if you have 100 first graders and the next year you have 120 second graders due to net migration, due to military bases, due to new homes, you've got a 20% bump up because of that. Now, we don't know why, but it's there and we see it in the data. So there's no really way of teasing out of where it's coming from. The key thing is if that migration is only happening a one-time event, that's when we have problems. That's that anomaly that you're referring to. When I looked at Mr. White gave me some of your data to look at for one of the attendance areas, and I looked at the survival ratios, the progression ratios from the last 14 years. That looked at boom times, it looked at bust times, and I really didn't see much of a difference in terms of, rather than just relative noise, which we normally see in these progression ratios. In some of my clients, that's partly because you have a very big, large grades where the noise can be dampened. But if you have a smaller grade cohorts, what I sometimes do is I throw out any ratios that are above ±1 standard deviation from the mean, because that is just too extreme. But I did not see anything like that just looking back. And as far as data sources that are out there, I'm going to be honest with you. I think the data sources that they're using are perfectly fine.
Krister, and then Alan, and then
If I can, John, if I can add just to that, part of, I think there's two pieces here. I absolutely agree with Rich. If we knew that the recession was going to happen, we'd have done lots of things different. We simply don't know those things. Having methods, and both the county and the school district have methods, and it gets to Rich's comment about alternatives. What would happen if unemployment took a dive 3 years from now? Being able to run the different methods and run different scenarios certainly doesn't tell you what's going to happen, but it gives you an idea of what the range of possibility is going to happen. The other thing, the Census Bureau produces from the American Community Survey microdata, public use microdata. And what it gives you is detailed characteristics about my response to the survey, my household information, my demographic information. That's a data source that could be mined, because you can look at migration and you can get a 1 year profile of who's moving in, who's moving out. So if you all had all the resources that you would love to have, that would be a data source that you could analyze and add value. IRS data, migration information, getting a better handle on that migration. Although IRS, well, we could go on about that. You have another question?
Krister?
Krister City. I think it's great that we get this external support in coming up with ideas for how our forecasts, which I think they both emphasized are realistically, in terms of precision, really possible to improve primarily in the short term. And of course, we know that even for the whole sort of lead time decision-making, siting, construction for a school, we are not talking about getting 2 or 5 years forewarning realistically. And moreover, here we are talking about not just school capacity, we are talking about demographics, what will our population situation be 20, 30 years down the road. It seems to me, and I'm picking up on something that Richard added sort of in passing at the end, that beyond what we can do to improve, perhaps in a relatively marginal way, our methodology in forecasting, that to a large extent, everything that is longer term depends much more on fundamental assumptions regarding things like future habits and preferences of huge population groups, like we talk about the millennials, and our ability, whether they are really, as you said, interested in, apropos Manhattan and applicable to Arlington, really going to be willing to stay for the longer term as en masse, or whether they will be seeking housing elsewhere, or whether we in Arlington will be able to provide the kind of housing at the prices that make sense for them to make them stay. And the same thing, if we are talking about the aging population, will they want to stay, and will we be able to provide a situation where they can age in place? So it seems that the correctness of assumptions about population in 2040 or something like that, and the composition of it, depends much more on sort of almost wild guesses, fundamental assumptions about some of these really major issues, rather than fine-tuning your methodology. So I would like to get some comments on that.
You have to be absolutely crystal clear. A projection, whether it's of school enrollment, housing, demographics, whatever, is a set of assumptions about what's going to occur in the future. And those numbers, if those assumptions are borne out, man, my projections are right on the money. Who would have imagined that 40 years ago I could have hit that number right on the nose? Well, I'd like to say it happens more frequently than it does, but chances are it's not, because we simply don't know. You have to understand projections are nothing more than that. Forecasts are my best guess about that set of assumptions, based on historical patterns, based on whatever bounds I can put around those assumptions, but we simply don't know.
Alan, and then Sal,
Okay. Alan Howes, and I want to start by thanking the two of you for the work you did, and I also actually want to thank staff for their cooperation in this. I'll say that this is the richest discussion of demographics that I have had in many years of following this, so I'm greatly appreciative of both of you all for coming together for this. My question, I've got a lot of questions, but I'll ask one now, which is something you also highlighted in your report around the data gap from 0 to 5. And getting clarity on that would also help to feed information up that would make your kindergarten, your projections better all the way through. So I'm wondering, one, are there recommendations for how we could do that? And for example, New York with their pre-K initiative, I presume there was some sort of modeling that they try to get a handle on what their numbers were before they put a dollar number behind it. So what are some ways that we could think about it? And that leads me into another question, which is that there are about 110,000 households in Arlington. About 37% of those are single-family homes, and that has been the primary driver of the school enrollment growth. So give or take 40,000 single-family homes. Are there other districts that just do phone surveys, random sample phone surveys of 10,000 households in there and actually have a sort of a real-time picture of what's going on in the district, sort of catching what Gabrielle was saying, some of these blips, some of these in and out migrations. So are there other tools that you're seeing other districts doing to give you a better, clearer snapshot?
Okay. All very good questions. Regards to the birth to K and the pre-K, at least in New York, that's actually still an ongoing process where we're trying to figure out how many are going to actually wind up coming into the system. And unfortunately, it is a problem. You've got 5-year gap between kids being born and then coming into the school system 5 years later. So what are your options? Can you do a phone survey? Could you do a mailing survey? All these different options at your disposal. In my experience, I don't think it's worth your time and money to do those kinds of things because of the bias that you're going to have. People not responding to those surveys that you're not going to capture. And remember, if you were to have a very good survey of any kind, phone, even going door to door and getting maybe a random sample, it's a snapshot. And with the migration that may happen in this community, it may be completely outdated in just a couple of months. In terms of what I'm seeing in most districts, we unfortunately try to live with the survival rate patterns from birth to kindergarten. And we try to, some of them, I have to be honest with you, your survival rate patterns from birth to kindergarten are pretty darn good compared to some districts that I'm looking at in terms of being stable. And what I'm seeing is that there was a point in time, I think maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where you were capturing about 68% or so of the number of births, and 5 years later they come up on your doorstep. Now it's somewhere in the low 70s, 72, 73%. And because of that stability, you've had really good kindergarten projections in the last couple of years. So I think that right now, at least right now, I would say that's your best bet. But to go and do a survey, I really, in my honest opinion, is I think you'd be throwing a lot of time and money into the wind. But Bob, you might have some comments on that. No? No? Oh, okay.
Sal?
Yeah, I was just curious in all your work around the country if you see any good studies on the millennials. They just seem to be a mystery to everyone. In Arlington, New York, these mysterious, and everyone's sort of afraid of the millennials. What are they going to do? Are they going to stay and go? Is there any trend that we see where the millennials are staying in certain areas? I can tell you I'm kind of an old Gen Xer, and when I look at the numbers from Arlington, we moved in here in 2000. We bought up a lot of the housing base. We had kids. We've stayed because we got in the bubble and rode that up to great appreciations in general. And the Gen Xers may not have that opportunity here, but are you seeing anywhere else around the country where certain factors and certain behaviors of the millennials are starting to play out in some way? Because that just seems to be a big question here. Like, we can't get our hands around these millennials. And I think if, to the extent that that's happening in other communities, can you share a little bit on that? I'm getting old, I think.
You're asking a guy who's 63 years old to try and get a handle on the millennials. I have 3 of them. 3 sons who were raised in New York, upstate New York, rural area. One of them is out here in the Reston area. 2 are in Los Angeles. I did a paper a number of years ago with a colleague at Cornell who has 3 sons. It was on brain drain because brain drain in New York State is a huge issue. At the time, he had a son in Boston, a son in Philadelphia, and a son in San Francisco. So if there's something that's going on, whenever I talk to my class and I ask them, you know, this is in Albany, how many of you are going to stay in Albany after you graduate? None of them. New York City, many of them are coming from the city, that's where they're going back. So this movement back to urban areas, and you know, Arlington is just prime for that population to come, whether, not necessarily come back, but to import from other areas because of federal jobs, just general mystique of Washington and what's going on here. All of the large metropolitan areas are experiencing that. New York, same thing. Boston, same thing. So can we get a handle on it? I'm not sure you can get much of a handle. Again, I come back to that microdata from the Census Bureau because you can look at that age range. What are their characteristics? What are their education? What are their occupations? You know, in roughly that mid-teens to 30s population. Where are they moving to and from? And I think mining that data helps get a handle on it. There's so much anecdotal stuff about the millennials in the media that it's hard to answer that question. So I come back to what can you do with the data? And that would be the data source to utilize.
But Sal is right. It is a key unknown that hovers over at least half of the questions that we're being asked to wrestle with.
I'll just add to that quick, John. That's a great question that you answered. I mean, some of the millennials are still living in their parents' basement. I mean, that's you know, part of the problem. I don't think that's the case here in Arlington, but you know, it doesn't seem to be. But a lot of the districts that I work with are in New Jersey, and they're suburban. And they have incredibly high median single-family homes and incredibly high taxes, $25,000, $30,000 on a single-family home. It just prices these people out, and they're completely not even interested in moving into these communities, and they have a really sharp declining enrollment because of it. And they keep asking me, well, when are these people going to start moving into our community? We expect them to come in. I don't think they're coming, and they don't seem to get that. I think they're more interested in living in an urban core. Again, this is anecdotal, and renting perhaps with the housing bust. They don't want to have a home where they're underwater with their mortgage. So a lot of these things kind of play out over time. We'll see.
Well, and they're coming to that urban core along with other millennials. I mean, all 3 of my kids did a stint in New York City, and they were rooming with 3 or 4 or 5 other kids because that's the only way they could afford it. Okay? So that affordability issue is big time. They're delaying marriage, they're delaying childbirth. If you look at fertility rates, we're talking about peak fertility rates in the early 30s rather than my generation, the early 20s. So those things are happening. So if you have from graduation of college at 22, 23 to 33 to room with friends, develop that base before you start a family, and then maybe you can afford that home, it's a very different process than what certainly we went through at those ages.
Greg?
Of comments and then a question. From the comments, I love your graph because what we've seen in the school population here was a boom in the 60s, followed by a decline, followed by yet another boom. And it fits very, very well with the idea of a housing stock that was built in the 50s, brand new owners who aged in place, and that led to the gradual decline of the school population. And as that housing stock was turning over, that gradually replenishing the students from that same housing stock. So I really, really hope that we can use that type of data to refine our forecasts for our single-family homes. Because, you know, looking at Lionel's numbers from the last presentation, the additional students we got in over the last 8 years from the single-family homes was greater than every other housing type added together. So we really do want to get a good handle on what our single-family homes will produce as students in our school system. My follow-up question is, we have also a fear that the generation factors in our multifamily homes will change. And we have a larger and growing housing stock of multifamily. Do you guys have ideas about getting a better insight into the potential or the futures that we could see with multifamily housing and student generation?
You know, in terms of that last part of your question, I would again look to that census microdata because I can look at household type and the demographics associated with it. You don't find in general census information those kind of cross tabulations. And so generating that unique type of characteristic, I think, would be a data piece of the data that you could start to look at and analyze. Housing type and monitoring that on an annual basis. Where it's going to go, that's still a tough one.
Yeah, the first part of your was more of a comment, I think, and I'll just, actually I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing I forgot to mention, it's actually in the report. When I work with New York City to find out student generation factors, we use the PUMS data set, which is what Bob has been talking about the last couple minutes. And our universe is recently constructed homes from the last decade. Now, you could probably do something like that even here to get a better handle on yields rather than looking at the whole entire stock. You know, you have to have a lot of homes, of course, built in that in the last 10 years. But the problem we run into is the sample size. The ACS is, you know, even if we use a 5% sample, we get these standard errors that are just over the top. And our coefficients of variation are just so ridiculous that it means that our yields are really just not worth the paper that they're printed on. So, and that's for the largest city in America that we're dealing with, New York City. So we have to start collapsing categories to the point where we cannot compute yields by age, and we like to do that because we want to know how many elementary kids, how many middle school kids, how many high school kids come out of a housing unit, but we can't do that. So we have to collapse it and get the yield for the whole entire borough. We don't do it by the city, and we can't even do it by housing type because of some of the sampling errors. So we have to look at, PUMS maybe is something you can look at, but that's another option because that graph that I showed you, it's analogous. I mean, the PUMS data is looking at recently built homes. So that whole thing, I'm trying to say, if we just look at the first 10 years, is kind of analogous to having homes that are just built in the last 10 years, because those are the people that are moving into the homes and buying the homes. And that's why I said to take the average of the first 10 years with that length of ownership model.
Tanya?
So I just wanted to, I guess, confirm with you guys some things. The reason that I think, or my understanding is the reason that you guys are here is because during the demographics of Arlington County and APS, there were some discrepancies or some misinformation, well, not misinformation, but just different presentations of information, okay? And so it sounds like both the county and the school system are doing a really good job in projections. Well, our job as a committee is to figure out what kind of fire stations we're going to need in the future, where they're going to go, schools, bus parking, transportation, all these things that are part of a community, you know, a growing community. And our community, as you said, is dynamic, unique because of the, you know, well, everyone knows why, because we've been discussing it for the last 5 meetings or whatever. So when we go and start analyzing this, should we be using, when we're projecting schools and bus transportation, the school data, and consider that more, you know, consider it as a hot, like a, in other words, sometimes there's a discrepancy as to a projection, okay? So if the county's saying that multifamily housing is going to produce 2 kids per unit and the school system is saying 1.5 kids per unit, well, when you're looking at big numbers, that 0.5 makes a big difference, right? Which one should we kind of focus on? Should we, for the fire station, should we use the county data? And for the school system, should we use the school data? Because clearly they're both good methodologies for their respective purposes. But for the purpose of our committee, what do we do? Because I don't know. You know, that makes sense. Well, sorry, because in my head it makes sense, but when I'm thinking, I'm like, you know, we need help.
Well, look, the student generation factors, this is where you got to collaborate between the two groups. And there shouldn't be a discrepancy between the two. I mean, in fact, the pipeline data is coming from the county government, so I find that kind of hard to fathom why they would be off. But they should be right they should be using the same data. In fact, when I work in New York City, where am I getting my data from? I'm getting my data from New York City Department of Planning. There is that level of collaboration between the two agencies, and I think that's happening here, and it's going to continue into the future. It's just it's a step that's going to continue and grow.
I'd only add to that depending upon why those differences are existing, you should be able to resolve them. Even if that there's no single perfect piece of data. So even if you resolve some of the major differences and you still have some difference between the two, that gives you your range of what ifs. So what if the county number is more accurate? What if the school district number is more accurate? It gives you that range, and it gets back to that, do I produce just one number, or do I produce a range, a high, medium, low? And that's the kind of factor that you would look at to gauge and use as a lever in your model.
We've got a couple of minutes left before we take a little bit of a stretch break. I'm going to see if there are a couple of questions other than the study group. This gentleman over here.
Hi, Mike Thomas, Arlington Forest. Thank you for a very interesting, informative presentation. I think you're absolutely right. It's a lot easier to make projections in a static environment than a dynamic environment. This is a very dynamic environment. We have a housing stock right now of, I think, 110,000 units. The county's projections are that we're going to add 40,000 units to that over the next 25 years. That's dynamic change. There's not room for single-family houses, so they're going to be multifamily. Well, if we look at the current data, we'd suggest that there are not going to be many students generated from that. And we think that most of the new students coming into the schools are from single-family houses. Yet, out of those 1,200 new students that came into the schools last year, 10% came from a single multifamily house or multifamily development. So they're not all the same. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be considering as we do this. The 40,000 new housing units that we're going to build in Arlington, are they going to be studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms? It makes a difference. If there are 2 and 3 bedrooms and the millennials move into those, that's a lot different than if there are a bunch of studios and 1 bedrooms. So until we have a vision of what we want Arlington to look like, I don't think we can begin to project who's going to be here and what sort of services we need.
Thanks, Mike.
Mind if I add to that? Just real quick.
This lady in the second row here. I'm sorry.
No, I just want to add real quick. I promise, 5 seconds. Just regarding the yields, you're absolutely correct. What we try to do is get specific yields by bedroom counts. And that's tough sometimes because a lot of times we just don't have the data on that. I'm not sure if the PUMs would even go down to that level in terms of number of bedrooms. But the other thing was, it does. I thought so. The other thing is that every multifamily development is not the same in terms of amenities. If it has, let's say, playgrounds in the back versus, next to a train station, you have to take that into consideration as well. So it is a very complex thing in forecasting yields. You just can't look at the building. A lot of other things have to come into play. Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Emily Schwartz-Greco. I live in Claremont, and I had a question and a suggestion. So the question is, since you did, it sounds like in this phase the consultants did not look at the execution of the APS projections. I was wondering if that would be possible to do, because as a parent, I just cannot understand why we have global growth of the entire school system of about a net of 500 children 8-9 years from now versus 1,200 in the past year. I think when you look at the millennials and everything else going on, the net gain should be more in the 1,000 student, not seeing at least around 1,000 student growth a year makes me question the execution over that 10-year period. So that's just a question, why the execution isn't being considered for those demographic figures. And then the suggestion is, I share the concern everyone has, is that everything here revolves around what do the millennials do. I agree that surveys can be problematic, because if you send a millennial household a survey asking them about, their kids, they're going to answer if they have kids or plan to have them. They'll throw it out if that's not in the cards right now. So maybe a poll would be more appropriate. I mean, we live in a region where people are pretty type A and driven. I just saw new data today showing that DC's millennials are the highest earning in the entire country. You know, if you ask millennials of that sort, where do you see yourself in 5 years, like those interview type questions? Do you see yourself forming a household? Do you see yourself living living where you are now or somewhere else? They might actually answer you. I don't know, it just seems like asking them what they're gonna do might yield some results, and I don't mean asking all of them, but a poll.
So I'm not sure what the best way of structuring such a poll would be. I think there's probably a lot of national anecdotal type approaches to that. I always caution my students to look at the source of the data, though, and if you're talking about all millennials' behavior based on a poll of 1,000, you probably have some issues there. On the first part of your comment about, you know, what might that enrollment be in 5 years, that's where I come back to the demographic method. If I can look at what the female population is going to, what the millennials of a certain age are going to be in 5 years, apply a fertility rate to them, I can generate a number of births. And that starts to give me that connection between the demographic change in terms of aging of the millennials who, you know, primarily are in their 20s now, not having children, and in 5, 10 years they're going to be in their 30s, and that's when they're having children. That's where I may be able to see that, yeah, you are going to look at another 1,000 increase 5 or 10 years down the road. So again, it's another piece of the puzzle. Is it going to tell you exactly? Probably not, but it's another piece that can add value to the methods that are already being used.
I'm going to take two more. Gentleman here on the end and the lady in the front row.
Gary Steele, I'm with the Nottingham PTA. The 2008 CIP for 2009 through 14 has 5-year projections in it. They were low for total enrollment by 18% 5 years out, and they were low for elementary by 27% 5 years out. So that's the degree of error built in. And it's one thing if their methodology might make sense, but the cohort progression rate that was described here when they went over that between 5th and 6th grade was a loss of 1.3% at that transition point. In the actual forecast that's out there, the cohort progression rate is different in every year and gets as high as a loss of 11% in the last year of the model. So we disappear 600 middle school students in the out years of our model, which then becomes an even larger number in high school later on. So I don't know if we have alien abduction of students going on, but we do not have the methodology that's predicted being executed in the numbers that we're basing our future plans on. So you're here to help us figure out if when we are opening a school that we've committed to this year in 4 years. When they talk about 1% accuracy, they're talking about their 1-year numbers. They're not talking about 1% per year. Their 5-year numbers are nowhere near 1% per year accurate. That's what we needed you to look into. So we need you to go back. And the other thing you need to keep in mind is that 2010 was a really bad year. Expecting the census to predict the financial crisis, the drawdown in Iraq for an area with a lot of military-related employment, we need to be looking at overall employment growth in the area. And to improve your model about the age would be great. But what we also need to look at, because we have so much build out of housing stock in the 1950s, you also need to be looking at the time, the age at which owners sell. Because if you have a whole lot of neighbors approaching retirement age or approaching end of life age, well, those houses are going to turn. And so you need to be looking at the age at which people sell and the average age and family size of home buyers in an area, because basically what happens is retirees who have been in their homes for 20 or 30 years sell to developers who double the size of the house, and then families buy it. And then the other thing we need to look at is the ratio, what happens as areas, and there are other cities who have done this before us, increase the cost of housing faster than income rises. Because the family that bought a starter home 5 years ago can't even buy that lot now. So they wait until they have 2 kids, 3 kids who are about to enter school, and then they move into that neighborhood and buy that bigger house because they have 5 years of home equity and 5 more years of stock market gains and 5 more years of savings to apply to buying into those areas. So there's some things we need to be doing. I hope we can ban the phrase the millennials. We are a tiny percentage of the DC area. We are a niche market. It's about, are we attractive to small niches of all of the generations that are having kids, which includes some pretty old parents in Arlington. And so it's not just the millennials who are having kids this year, who are going to be driving our high school enrollments 18 years from now. So anyway, that's a set of comments. As people know, I have many more, but I'll shut up.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, you have the last word.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm absolutely shocked at the cavalier attitude that you have towards fertility rates. Now, in my mother's generation, if a woman didn't have a baby by the age of 18, she was considered not a woman. You know, and my mother, she was old when she had me. Now, in my generation, women, a lot of women who were college educated, delayed children and into their 40s. But, you know, I don't know how you figure that. When I listen to television reporters talk about demographics in the United States, they say, well, the Hispanic community has a far greater fertility rate. They have more children per family. They have children earlier. We have a large Hispanic population. And I'm not saying this to be in any way racist, but I don't think that you can, I don't know how you're going to figure fertility rates. I mean, are you going to, you know, figure out what the percentage is of Hispanics who are likely to have larger families earlier in life, or the percentage of women who are college educated who are more likely to delay and have fewer kids? I don't know how you figure that, but you know, just saying, oh well, you know, by the time a woman reaches 30, she's going to have kids. I mean, it's just not. That's not an easy calculation.
I hope I didn't convey a cavalier attitude towards it. There's data. The State Health Department and the National Center for Health Statistics will provide us with birth data by age of woman. So we can look at census populations by age, and we can look at the number of births by women of that age at a county level. And from that, you calculate a fertility rate. What proportion of women aged 30 to 34 are having children? And when you look at that graphic, in the baby boom years, that graph starting at about 15 to 19 had a sharp peak by 20 to 25, and then it gradually tapered off. When we look at that graph today, it's low in the 20s, and then by the late 20s and 30s, early 30s, you hit that peak. And then, yes, it tapers off again, a little bit higher with women in the 40s, but still that peak is in those ages of 30 to 34. Are there variations by race? Yes. Black fertility, Latin fertility, Asian fertility. The data exists. The quality is a question mark, but you can still look at those patterns. And yes, national trends for higher fertility of Hispanics, correct. Is that also the case in Arlington? We can look at the data. So I come back to saying you've got to look at the data to really understand how Arlington behaves similar to other areas or differently to other areas, but the data exists to do that.
With that, let me recognize we've been joined by County Board Member John Weistat. Let's take a 5-minute break, chance to get up, stretch, say hello to somebody you didn't say hello to earlier, ask these gentlemen additional questions, but we will start again in 5 minutes.